Mesdames et messieurs,
The greatest festival of our contemporary society, the Olympic Games, is about to begin.
this is gonna be close.
Oh! They're all completely gassed! They've given it everything on their global bucket! Oh, yeah! Go! Oh!
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. But that is an Olympic championship.
Ready.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Keep the Flame Alive, the podcast for fans of the Olympics and Paralympics. If you love the games, we are the show for you. Each week we share stories from athletes and people behind the scenes to help you have more fun watching the games. I am your host, Jill Jarris, joined as always by my lovely co-host, Allison Brown. Allison, hello. Gobble, gobble. How are you?
Happy Thanksgiving. Are you thoroughly in food coma now?
I should be. Hopefully. Well, actually, we are traveling on Thanksgiving Day this year.
As
Because
our way.
It is our turn to travel. So we will be on the road on Thanksgiving and we will be celebrating mostly on Friday, I think.
Oh, you know what? I am a full supporter of you celebrate Thanksgiving when it works for you.
So it's Thanksgiving Day and we are thankful for our patrons who keep our flame alive literally by keeping our show going with their financial contributions. This is the time of the year where we give a shout out to our Golden Committee member level patrons. So we'll be celebrating a patron every week. And this week, celebrating Jennifer Schultz, who has been a long time patron. Jennifer.
She goes back a ways.
Yes.
We won't say how old, but
Because then it forces us to realize how old this show is.
I know, and how
we
old we are. Yeah, let's not talk about that.
But Jennifer, thank you for keeping our flame alive for so many years, and we really appreciate your support. And you can find out more about becoming a member of Patreon at patreon.com/flamealivepod. You can also gift Patreon memberships as well. So if you are looking for a unique gift or want to give your gift givers who want to know what to give you another option, you could ask for a Patreon gift membership. Find out more at patreon.com/flamealivepod. And thank you, Jennifer. It's book club week.
I love book club week because one, we get to see Claire. So that's always fabulous. And this, spoiler alert, was really good.
Yes. Yeah, we've had some good books this year. So
We
that's
have.
been nice. Book Club Claire is back. We are discussing Today We Die a Little, the inimitable Emil Zatopek, the greatest Olympic runner of all time by Richard Askwith. It is a biography of the Czechoslovakian runner who competed in long distance races at London 1948, Helsinki 1952, and Melbourne 1956. He was self-coached and known for some really out there training techniques like intervals, which was not really popular back in the day, and other things that most people at the time did not use. Those training techniques have become more ingrained today. He was also known for a unique running style in which he looked like he was in massive pain and kind of flopped around a little bit with his upper body. Also one that is noted a lot. At London, he won silver in the 5,000 meters and gold in the 10,000 meters. But Helsinki 1952 was his crowning achievement. He's the first and only person to win gold in the 5,000, 10,000, and the marathon, which was his first marathon he ever ran. He became a hero in Czechoslovakia and around the globe, an important figure who gave a small nation global recognition. At Melbourne 1956, he was not quite as successful. He dropped out of a couple races and he competed in the marathon, but not he finished, let's just say. So we talk about those races. We also talk about how he was an interesting figure in Cold War politics who got into some trouble with the governments of the Iron Curtain. Take a listen. Claire, welcome back. What do you got for us?
I have our second and final book club book of 2024 called Today We Die a Little, The Inimitable Emil Zátopek, the greatest Olympic runner of all time by Richard Askwith. And this has been a book that has been in our queue for quite a few years, and only now have we decided to give it a shot. So I want to ask you first, who was the MVP of the book and why was it Dana Zatopek? Seriously, she is the queen.
She really is. And I think she held it together. Was married to a man who very much had the limelight and whose training sometimes took precedence over hers. She was also dealing with a husband who couldn't shut up in a place where you had to keep quiet. If that makes sense. I didn't want to. It was great that he was super friendly and outgoing and gregarious, and taught himself how to speak a ton of languages so he could talk to people. But living in communist Czechoslovakia at the time, that made life very tough in a way. And so she did have to put up with a lot of extra scrutiny, and not just because she herself was an elite athlete, but also because her husband's motor mouth kind of affected their lives after a while.
Yes, Dana was amazing. I'm actually gonna give the MVP to the author on this one
Ooh.
because I thought he did an absolutely brilliant job of balancing that Emil is human and he's also superhuman, and he did heroic things and he did not heroic things. And Askwith talked a little bit about his own conflicted view, and I thought he balanced the story brilliantly, and I was left conflicted myself about Emil and what I thought of him and his career, which I think is probably accurate.
I would wholeheartedly agree. I think that Richard Askwith did an amazing job with this book. It is a rather large book, but it doesn't ever seem too monotonous. He keeps it engaging with talking about the training and the races, and also the dealings with the Soviets, how they were coming in and into Czechoslovakia. And he does a really nice job. And for once, he does admit that, this is kind of my opinion. We've read so many other books where opinions are stated as fact, or, especially with the autobiographies that we've read, what I write down on this paper is law, and some people trust it and others don't. And there's all that conflict. But Askwith is just very blunt and says, here's the two sides, here's what I think. And there's even a whole chapter basically of him kind of explaining his rationale. But going back to Dana, who I am on Jill's side with her being the MVP, I did not realize that she had won a gold medal, and I did not realize she won it within an hour of her husband. And we've been talking about Hunter Woodall and Tara Davis Woodall and how they won a Paralympic gold and an Olympic gold in the same year. But can you imagine winning with your husband within an hour of each other? I thought that was amazing. The fact that she was a world-class athlete and married another world-class athlete, and maybe even beyond world-class for him. And they made it work. And they trained together and they worked together and they stuck with each other even through thick and thin. And I just think she is the best. And every time she came up in the book, I was just like, oh, yay, more Dana.
And I don't think a not athlete could have put up with Emil because she could understand it to a point. She understood. I mean, he took his interval training and his training to almost grotesque levels, but she got it. And she knew that drive and that feeling. And then when his career was over and hers kind of wasn't, she could accept what he was going through because she knew that was coming for her. And so I don't think anybody else could have put up with the ups and downs that he put her through.
And when it was bad weather, somebody who would be running in place in the house for hours on end.
Yeah, the training methods that he came up with were at times eye-opening. It's like, oh, this is where interval training kind of started, the genesis of that. But also there were some like running in the tub or something going, you really thought that was a good idea? Okay. My question is regarding his training. Do you think he needed to do the interval training in order to be a gold medal athlete? Or do you think he would have had enough natural talent for it to bloom on its own? It's an interesting question. It came to my mind because he was so invested in his training. It's like, did he need to do all of that? What do you think?
I'm going to say yes, because I think we now have too much at stake of talent. Like we talk about, oh, this person is so talented. And the biggest thing that I think I've learned from talking to so many athletes is, yes, talent plays a part, but commitment and dedication are what make the difference between good athletes and elite athletes and gold medalists. And that killing yourself in training is what, and I mean not, there is such a thing as overtraining, but that commitment to doing better, pushing yourself harder is what makes the difference.
That, and he may not have needed such intense interval training to win, but when you think about how much he was shattering records by in terms of seconds and minutes, and when I read the book and I was just trying to picture him lapping people constantly in major races, that just is a testament to how much his training worked and how much they were shattering records by. And you don't necessarily see the same kind of shattering of records. You see records dropping, but it's not by like 20 seconds. But I think that the interval training just played to his advantage and really propelled the concept of what you needed to do to train to be the best you could be.
It was interesting because this was another Soviet era Olympic book. There are so many of them because a lot happened in that Cold War time. This is the first one where performance enhancing drugs never played a part. It was just this guy
that we know of.
that we know of. But it's just that he just had so much raw talent that he knew how to train, and he was living at just the right time where he was shocking the world with his talent, emerging out of Czechoslovakia, not known for its running, unlike places like France and Great Britain at the time, and really dominating for at least 2 Olympics and many years in between as well. Do you think a coach would have helped or hindered his training?
Hindered. I think any coach would have said to him, "You're nuts, Emil. Don't do this. Don't train like this. Don't do these intervals. Don't go running in your boots." Jill and I were together this weekend, so we were reading it at the same time. And, don't go running in the woods in your army boots, because the one thing Jill said to me was, how does he never trip on a root? How does he never sprain his ankle? And it's very true. The fact that he had one serious injury, but not constant serious injuries. No coach would have let him train the way he did.
Concur, Jill?
Yeah, totally agree. I think that a coach would have, and probably especially in that place during that time, and if you're talking about a Cold War era, I think a coach would have tried to lay down the hammer and say, no, you have to train the way I say. And we would not have gotten the same Emil. We would have not gotten the same results or even the same way you push the sport forward.
I think the only coach that would have helped him in any way would have been a coach that was as crazy as he was. If somebody was totally outside the box, who you might have come across if Emil existed now and was training now, where people are so much more open to new ideas and things that could change the landscape. But at that time, as you said, Jill, there was such a more strict training regimen.
He needs the coach from Chariots of Fire.
I was just thinking that. That's exactly what I was going to say. He needs Abrams' coach from Chariots of Fire, the coach willing to go outside the box and willing to buck the system and do things differently to push the sport forward.
I don't even know if I've seen all of Chariots of Fire. If I have, it's been way too long. Is this based on, I know the story is based on a true story, but is the coach based on real facts? Okay.
He is. Musabian, I think the name was. But yeah, he was a very unconventional coach at the time.
These were questions that came up to me as I'm reading about his, strict interval regimen. He was so strict on himself. I think that's the only way he could have succeeded without a coach for his entire career, which is pretty amazing. He was in 3 Olympics. He was in 1948 and 1952 and 1956. London, Helsinki, and Melbourne. What was a story from one of those Olympics that stuck out to you besides him and Dana winning gold within an hour of each other?
I thought it was interesting because we did read the book about Melbourne 1956. So seeing that Olympics come back and some of the things that we read about in that book from a different angle, the concern about defections from the Eastern Bloc. The minders and the sharp eyes that they talked about watching all the Eastern athletes, and they all knew it. And just that Cold War feeling again. Whenever we read about the Cold War, it takes me back to when I was a kid. And I mean, Jill and I grew up with that, hearing that news. And that, the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and even into the 80s, it was so similar with that us and them. And they were so different. And here's Emil coming in, learning 47 different languages to talk to everybody. And how nobody, even the sharp eyes, could not contain this man.
Yeah, 1956 was interesting for me because I didn't realize he had that long of a career. And that's, in an era where you're talking about people are usually one and done for the most part because of amateurism. So then on the flip side, I was surprised to see him at London 1948 as well, just because I know of Emil Zatopek as Helsinki 1952. Like that's his games. But to see him before he becomes a name and to see him when he has so much faith in his training and then it doesn't play out exactly as he wants it to in London, which fuels the fire to do even more to make sure he is on top at Helsinki. That I really enjoyed. And seeing how, again, we talked a little bit about those austerity games and seeing them from his perspective. And I did go back and watch a little bit of highlight video to see that, it rained that day. So the cinders were everywhere and everyone's kind of coated in mud and they're just running and running and running. And he just doesn't quite make it, but it's a thrilling race nonetheless. So that's a precursor of what's to come.
You can't have Helsinki without London for him because he learned a very important lesson, and that's something that track athletes in distance racing on the track, that's something that distance racers who do the track learn very quickly. One of the first races, for at least for the men's most years, is the 10,000 because there's no heats. They just shove them all there and they say good luck and they shoot the gun and you're off. But he learned very quickly he can dominate the 10K, but then a few days later he's going to have a heats for the 5,000 and a finals. And nowadays I think there's even 3 rounds for the 5K that he needed to pace himself. And because he learned that in London, he needed that for Helsinki. And I mean, Helsinki, he even threw in the marathon for good measure. Why not just keep on running, which is insane. Just thinking that he had never run a marathon before, that like the length of a marathon. Although nowadays a lot of people don't run the length of a marathon until they run the marathon. But it's amazing to me to see how he learns his lesson from one to the other. And Melbourne, having to travel by boat all the way to Australia, which at the time did not take a very short amount of time, and then have to deal with all of that. And also that's where the title of the book comes from, because he lines up for his marathon in Melbourne and he just looks to his buddies on his left and his right and he says, today we're going to die a little. And I think to pick that title for the book was chef's kiss. I think that was very spot on. Any other Olympic things that you wanted to cover? I know there's a lot to this book and only like a third of it is Olympic related, but I wanted to make sure you had time to cover that Olympic side of things.
Are we going to talk about the pre-52 I'm not going?
Yeah, the prologue. He had a friend who was detained and not allowed to go. And so he sits out the team flight to Helsinki. And as the kind of the Michael Phelps of his country, that was a big deal. Fortunately, they did allow his friend to join up with the team. That was probably the first time where he really took a stand, I think. And maybe it went to his head because he kept going after that. Did you have any other thoughts on it?
The scariest thing to me in that 52 moment was Dana's on the plane and she's taking off and he's not with her. So now she's flown to Helsinki. He's back in Czechoslovakia, and how she's trying to achieve her dreams. And she doesn't know if her husband's been arrested and disappeared because he's taking a political stance against the communist Soviet-backed government. And people did just disappear. I mean, probably not someone of his caliber, but still. So how terrifying that must have been for her to just sit on that plane and take off and not know what was gonna happen for a couple of days, it seemed like.
Yeah, and it was interesting because you also have the government officials who have detained him. And are they going to be the hardliners and crush his dreams or to prove a point? And then who knows what they would do with him next? He'd probably be in jail or camp or something for a long time. Or do they let him go and he would be the one to bring Czechoslovakia glory on a global stage? Because he really did bring a lot of attention, great attention to the country because of his success at these Olympics. I mean, it's a really interesting of these standoffs and the tension. And we talk with athletes today about the pressures they're under. These athletes were under different kinds of pressures, I think, but pressure all the same.
He ended up becoming a real icon in Europe because of the things that he did. So for him to not have made that appearance in Finland for the Olympics in 52 would have been very noticed by the people in Europe, because if they followed track and field between the gap years of 48 to 52, they knew his name. They knew he was breaking records. So I think that I don't want to say they made the right choice letting him go. I think that what they did was dumb to even detain him in the first place, or to detain his friend, so that he felt like he needed to make that stand and say, no, I'm not going to go unless you do this. But they made the wrong choice, and then they made the right choice in letting him go. Yeah, that was a big story that, as far as I know, was not big news at the time because nobody knew about it, because that's how communist-led countries kind of ran things. Speaking of, I did notice there is this kind of back and forth in the book, which Askwith balances pretty well, of Emil, kind of the revolutionary, balanced with Emil, the person who is putting out statements decrying or speaking against the people who are against communism. And the letter that he released in the newspaper between the Prague Spring, where he was super supportive, it was interesting to hear that. So we know Askwith's opinion on Zatopek and what he was thinking. Do you have kind of an ultimate opinion on Zatopek, the Czech man, when it comes to his role in Soviet politics of Czechoslovakia?
I think he was ordinary in many ways, in that he supported communism. He had grown up under fascism. He had seen the evils on the other way. And he was a good Czech communist in some ways. He also recognized the oversteps, the danger, the censorship, the suppression of ideas, suppression of people. But in the end, he wasn't an anti-communist hero. He was an ordinary athlete who felt both sides. I wanna run, I wanna do my thing, but this isn't fair. But am I gonna go to prison over this? I don't know, it's too far. So I don't think he's a hero, I don't think he's a villain. I think he was a very ordinary man in very extraordinary times.
And one who his job and his livelihood really depended on towing the line at times. And I'm sure there are plenty of moments where he got talkings to. And especially when there's elements of the book where Asquith finds, oh, he signed his name to X document that got printed in the paper, and we're going to blow up the signature for everyone to see that your hero has let you down again. And we don't know. And Asquith, you can't really, he says, like, you can't definitively find these things out. And a lot of records from this era got destroyed. Did he really believe that? Or did he have to sign it because he had to sign it? And how much of a stand is he willing to take? Like Ellison said, there are people in Czech history who spent time in prison. Václav Havel is one of the big ones who, once the wall went down, he became the president. But I think Zatopek's life and livelihood were a little different. Havel could still write in prison, or at least think in prison. Meanwhile, Zatopek, if he wasn't running, I don't think he'd be as inspirational if he wasn't still appearing on the global stage, to be quite honest.
And he does fall from grace.
Oh,
He does get exiled and shunned and pushed aside and forgotten, and it breaks him in many ways. There was a good 10 years toward the end of his life where he becomes an alcoholic and really, really struggles. And I don't think that was an atypical story in the Eastern Bloc in those Iron Curtain years. I think a lot of people were broken, and it is unfair to judge them by our standards, both in the West and today, to say, what is more important, surviving, getting through, coming out the other side, or this stance? And everybody has to make that choice for themselves.
we don't know that maybe Zatopek, maybe he didn't think far enough in advance to, I will not be running someday. I mean, kind of near the end of his competitive career, you start to see him saying, okay, I'm not going to run the 5,000 anymore. But how much did he plan for life after running? And once he was done running, he was of no use to the army, and they could finally go after him for not towing the line for his entire running career, and saying, and they could have, I don't want to say the last laugh, but they played the waiting game. And once Zatopek was no longer useful to them, they could just toss him aside. And I don't think he was really ready for that, because he was a national hero and he thought that would stay, at least in some elements. And it really didn't. And that it is very tragic how he fell from grace. It's really kind of hard and sad to read about him being a regular person during his prime really came back to bite him once his career was over.
It also seemed like that was the one place where Askwith was critical of his ego, where
Mm.
it seemed like Zatopek didn't understand that he was getting away with stuff, that he just thought, I'm fabulous. I can say what I want. I can do what I want. And because I'm me, nobody's going to come after me. And that's not how regimes like this work, right? When you're useful, like Jill said, then they'll accept some variance. But once you're not useful, man, is that gonna come back at you.
As I was reading about Zatopek's ups and downs, especially post career, all I could think of was, yeah, those are the things that I would have done. Or this is the things that an average human would have done. They're not thinking, I must preserve my image for people. He didn't have an agent that was like, oh, that's probably a bad idea. He's just doing what any regular human would have done in his shoes. And I can really respect that this was one of the first books where I was really seeing him just as an average person, just doing the things of life. And yes, sometimes those led him to make mistakes, and sometimes it led him to make really good decisions. But I did really respect Askwith and Zatopek for that, because I couldn't think of him as either the hero or the villain, just like you had mentioned. It's just some dude who spoke up, didn't realize he probably shouldn't have, because he doesn't have an image coordinator making sure that his name is not rolled through the mud.
And then when he realized he shouldn't have spoken up, back down to protect himself, back down to protect his wife and his friends, and, said things like when he was exiled, don't be seen with me. It's not good for you because I made some mistakes.
It brings up an interesting topic that always pops up when you're talking about a sports figure who grows up in momentous times of history, is how much pressure should be put on them to speak out for their country, whether it's for or against something that they're doing. We've been dealing with that in recent years with things that have happened, and it kind of brings it back again, seeing what history has shown with Zatopek.
That's an interesting point, because you do get that throughout history, is people who protest in one way or another, or they're trying to use their platform to say something. We see that. We definitely saw it in Mexico City 1968 with the fist. We saw it in Tokyo. They had some non-podium protests. We saw it with the runner who made the X over his chest in the marathon in a recent Olympics. We saw it in Paris with the breakdancing woman from Afghanistan who had the Free Afghan Women sign on her cape on the field of play. So there is a lot of wanting to make a statement and highlight some injustice that is happening to an athlete's people. But how successful is that? And do we remember the protest, or do we remember the situation that they're protesting? And how much does the protest affect the situation, whether good or bad?
And so often here in the United States, certainly there's been lots of protests surrounding professional football and the whole idea of shut up and play. And what do we want from our athletes? We want our athletes to agree with us. So if they're protesting something that we agree with or over the course of history proves them right, they mention this in this book, the Vera Koslowska protest against the Soviet Union in Mexico City. She's viewed as a hero, right, for making that because she was on the right side of history. I'm sure the Russians would have a very different opinion of that podium protest. So when they agree with us, great. When they don't, then they're villains. So where does that fall down? And how do you know 50 years from now how that's going to look down as history? You just have to do what's right in your soul, right? You have to make those choices personally. And I think that's what this book does so successfully in showing that Emil was both. He was a guy, he was an athlete, he was trying to do his thing, trying to make it through life. And yeah, when he saw injustice, he wanted to do something about it, but he wasn't a freedom fighter in his gut. That wasn't where his life was. His life was running.
Yeah, and it's interesting what we look to athletes for, and any kind of celebrity. Do we look for them for how to live, or what to buy, what to wear, how to look? Why shouldn't athletes and celebrities be able to say, "Hey, this problem is important," and draw attention to it? I will say I did enjoy the Vera Kozlovska cameo that showed up in this book, and how she got treated. We saw what happened afterwards and how she got exiled as well. That was so interesting.
It makes what's happening nowadays a little more relevant because a lot of times I'm seeing this right now in a community that I'm in on social media where people are implying, well, politics is not relevant to this topic that we're discussing. And, everybody's just coming up, well, of course it is, it's everywhere. And if you can't tell somebody, an athlete, to shut up and play because they're going to be affected by it just as much as you are. It kind of makes this topic pretty relevant for this month, if I do say so myself. Well, a final question that I have, and then I'll open it up to you guys. Why do you think he stayed in Czechoslovakia? Because he did have offers when he went overseas to defect and coach both in Sweden and Finland, if not others. Why do you think he stayed? And I think we've talked about it, but you can just say it now.
It was home. He was Czech, and that was the end of the story. Why would he want to be someplace else besides home?
I also think and wonder if he had some sort of awareness that he would not have been a good coach for others. And if you go over and you coach and your athletes are not receptive to your kind of training, or you can only think that this is the kind of training that works and that's it. I mean, Emil Zatopek was probably the same kind of runner and would have been a coach the way that coaches would have been bad for him. We just talked about how if you have a coach that's set in their ways and they're like, this is how you do it, and that's it. I think Zatopek would have been the same kind of coach. This is the way that works. And that was the way that worked for him, but it's not going to be the way that worked for other athletes. I'm not sure he would have been able to be as successful. And he had a comfortable life in Czechoslovakia. So do you give that up for maybe the awareness that life might have been more difficult in the West in terms of, oh, I had to fend for myself a lot more?
I tend to think along the lines of you guys. Of course, he wasn't going to leave because he wanted to stay and defend his country from what he would have thought, was ruining his country. I also think, well, if he had left to coach, regardless of the coaching, but he could have been a bigger outspoken voice to say, this is what is happening in Czechoslovakia. These are the things that you're not seeing behind the scenes and could have been an even bigger force to show that, where somebody who's behind the Iron Curtain doesn't get that much play. That's the only reason I was really thinking, well, he could have, because he could have kept speaking about it and made it more relevant to people because they knew who he was. That's what came to my mind as I was thinking about this. Do you have any final thoughts on the book or on Zatopek in general?
I've really enjoyed this book. You look at it and you're like, wow, this is a really thick book, but it's highly readable. And I wouldn't say it's like the quickest read, but it's not a slow read at all. It just kind of kept going. And the way Askwith outlined it and told the story, it really kept moving along and it was so engaging. I just really enjoyed reading this book. And I do have to say, by the end, when we're dealing with all of his exile, it makes me want to read a John Le Carré novel, which is on my nightstand right now.
I thought this book was extremely successful on many, many different levels. It was an interesting biography. It was an interesting analysis of Cold War politics. It was interesting for athletics fans because you got to see some of the training. It was interesting for us as Olympic fans. So definitely top 2 or 3 of the books we read in terms of just, I came away from this book knowing so much more and understanding so much more on many different things. So highly recommend.
Yeah, if you have not read this book, it is definitely worth picking up. Like I mentioned it earlier, we've had this on the list for many years, and only now did we pick it out. It's like, oh, it was worth it. It was worth having it on the shelf. You know, it's one that reappears. I'm a little disappointed because the book that I got, it's from a library, and it says withdrawn from the library. This book was only published in 2016, and the fact that it's already withdrawn is kind of sad because it's like nobody checked it out. You should check it out. So if you're not going to buy it, go to your library and check it out so that it doesn't get discarded. But yes, very good book. Askwith, if he wrote any more Olympic-based or Paralympic-based books, I would love to check those out for sure. But that's a wrap on Emil Zatopek.
Excellent. It's been a highly entertaining year in book club, I would say. The 2 choices were both so good, and just makes me love the fact that we have a book club even more. So thank you, Claire, for all that you do. And what are we looking forward to in 2025?
I can't believe it's already 2025. That's insane. I'm a child of the 90s, and 2025 was like the future. Anyway, we have 3 books for 2025 that we're going to be reading. And one of them is by Ashok Flistani. She's going to be our first read of the year. Sydney Collier. She's a Paralympian, and she wrote a book called Beyond Expectations. We're going to be reading that one in March, so that maybe that would make a good Christmas present for someone if you want to take a read of that. Then we are going to be going back in time, not too far, to 2018. And I don't know if you are in the Facebook group, dear listener, but they just asked, how did you find Keep the Flame Alive podcast? And a lot of people were saying, you know, from certain Olympics. And for me, I discovered this podcast when I was listening for the Pyeongchang Olympics in 2018. And so we are going to go back to that time, 2018, Pyeongchang, South Korea, and we're going to be reading A Team of Their Own, which is all about the unified Korean team, North and South Korea, for the women's hockey tournament of that year. And one that also has been on our list for a bit, so it'll be interesting to read that one. And then at the end of the year, we're going to take a little break in the summertime, and we're going to be reading Above and Beyond by Tim Mack. He is an American pole vaulter who competed around the turn of the century, and we're going to be hearing his story. So those are the 3 books we've got.
Tim Mack is from Cleveland area.
That's why you pushed for this book.
That's another one. He's got a really, really interesting story about it. It's a very much an underdog story of not making the Olympics, and then making the Olympics. So I'm really excited to read his story.
I will say, any chance for us to do more track and field books, I am not going to say no. So go for it. Let's do it.
Excellent. Well, Claire, thank you so much as always, and we will look forward to seeing you next year.
Happy New Year.
Thank you so much, Claire. You can follow Claire on Insta and YouTube at CNAT Travels. She's got some of her own Paris 2024 videos up on her YouTube page. She did a lot of ours as well. So they're up on our channel. So we will have links to those in the show notes. I was thinking about this as we were getting ready for the show.
Were you thinking about how you got to say Czechoslovakia multiple times?
I did think that as I was just saying it. That was awesome. I also have to admit that I have fallen into a little Cold War comfort reading, and I am now reading John le Carré's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold.
So you've got East Germany and Yugoslavia back on deck.
I know, and besides a shelf full of Olympic and Paralympic books, I do have a shelf full of Cold War type books. So I think I'm going to be working my way through some of that stuff.
It's Czechoslovakia in Jill's house this holiday season.
Oh, you better believe it. But, Askwith calls Zatopek the greatest Olympic runner of all time. And it feels like that title gets bestowed on long distance runners more so than sprinters. And we've got some great sprinters throughout history, and especially in our lifetimes, we had Carl Lewis and we had Usain Bolt
Michael
and
Johnson.
Michael Johnson. Yes, thank you.
Who did a double that nobody else has done. A double that nobody else has done. And yeah, sprint. But you know what I think it is? Sprinters don't run for very long. I don't mean that in years. I mean that in seconds.
Yeah.
So distance runners, I think, are like there's distance runners and then there's sprinters. I don't know. Maybe just because you watch them for hours at a time.
I don't know. I think it's interesting. Yes, there's something to be said for enduring long races, especially with the faster pace that a long distance race can have and how you have to make that last for a longer period of time. But there's also something amazing about training to be the fastest runner in a race that is now less than 10 seconds.
I wonder if it's that distance runners do tend to have longer careers than sprinters, so that you will see them for multiple Olympics. It's not strange, as Zátopek did 3 Olympics. A lot of distance runners do multiples and then sometimes go from, say, the 10,000 to the marathon. They have that longevity that sprinters, certainly in the past, didn't have. Now a little bit more, but still, it's not unusual to be a one and done Olympic sprinter.
Yeah, it's hard to maintain that speed, especially like you said, with the transitioning to longer and longer distance. We saw that with Abdurrahman, who we read his book as well and talked with him. And yeah, maybe that longevity in moving to a different distance helps, which then makes me ask, have any sprinters become marathoners?
Oh, now would you stop with the rabbit holes in Czechoslovakia?
Have any Czechoslovakian sprinters become marathoners?
I mean, it's such a different, not only physicality, but the brain of a distance runner. And I say this every time we talk to someone who does distance events. What do you think about? Like, what's on your mind during that time? A sprinter can't think during his or her event. There's not enough time. It's too fast. They just have to trust their training and that their body will do what their body's supposed to do. Distance athletes have to think in a different way. They have to keep focus and they have to not let their minds wander. So to switch between those two would be such a different personality type.
It's interesting. We are going to touch base, hopefully, with Kenny Bednarek. He's on the schedule, but as you know, it doesn't happen until it happens. We have to put this on our list to ask him.
What are you thinking about during the race?
Right. And can you think in some races and not in others?
Because he does the 100 and the 200, and those are very different races, even though they're both sprints.
Right. And would he consider adding distance as he grows older?
I bet he's going to say no. He'd be like, no, I don't want to run that long. Who's got time for that? I'd get bored. I bet a lot of sprinters would be like, no, I would get bored running that long.
I am very curious about this now, because I think we have talked to more long distance runners or people talking about longer distances and even like middle distance where you've got a little time. But yeah, we haven't been able to talk to that many sprinters. So Kenny's going to give us some insight.
Did you like Emil Zatopek? Like, would you have wanted to hang out with him?
I don't know. I bet he was a fun guy at like post-race stuff or at the party. I think my apprehension about that is because I'm a woman. I bet
Oh,
people loved him, but I think of like what you talked about with Dana.
yeah,
Like she put up with a lot.
she did. I wouldn't want to be married to him, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah. That would be hard. But I don't know. They probably had fun. I mean, if you were just like the type of couple who were like, "Yeah, come on over." But I think he was probably a little too careless for his time and place. I think he was too careless, and I think that would have been very worrying to me. You might let your guard down if you were in a different country, but if you were in Czechoslovakia, how I mean, Asquith didn't and probably couldn't go into the web of people that were connected to him. What happened to them, and were there any ramifications for knowing Emil or being close with him? What about
It's
you?
I would have loved to hang out with him, but God forbid being married to him, I would have lost my mind. Or having to work with him. Like being his friend or
Yeah,
being a friend of a friend and you got to do things with him,
yeah,
like go to some of those parties,
yeah.
that would have been great. But to work with him would have probably been really difficult and scary. I mean, what a scary time. We forget. We forget
Mhm.
how scary that was in Czechoslovakia.
Well, I will start reading Gulag, and I will remember. Oh, well, it has been a good year for book club. We've got the next year's books on tap. We will have those at our bookshop.org site. We will have those at our bookshop.org site on our lists of book club shows and books we're reading. There's also other lists that we've curated there. You can check those out at bookshop.org/shop/flamealivepod. And any purchase that you make through that our link will help us earn a commission. It doesn't have to come from one of our curated lists. And believe you me, any commissions we earn are greatly helpful as we wind down Paris, but we have to immediately wind up and start raising money for Milan Cortina and any kind of travel associated with that as well. So thank you so much. And thank you for listening. We do appreciate your listenership on every day, but on this Thanksgiving Day especially. So that is going to do it for this episode while we go eat some Thanksgiving dinner. Hopefully you are celebrating as well. And if you don't celebrate Thanksgiving because you're in another country,
Celebrate anyway.
yeah, right. Eat a good meal. Let us know who you think the greatest runner is of all time.
And we love hearing from you. You can chat with us and other listeners on our Facebook group, Keep the Flame Alive Podcast. Email us at flamealivepod@gmail.com. The voicemail and text line is always open at 208-352-6348. That's 208 Flame It. If you need more Olympics and Paralympics in your life, and who doesn't, sign up for our newsletter at flamealivepod.com. We'll have a link to that in the show notes.
Next week, we will be back with more Paris memories as we talk with Paris swimmer Mackenzie Cohen. She has got some hot takes on the chocolate muffins, so do not miss this conversation. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep the flame alive.